Welcome to the Supervisors Academy. My name is Gloria Coe, and I serve as the Senior Director for Alumni Career Engagement with the UCLA Alumni Association. I'm a proud double Bruin and super excited to bring you this program today. Before we begin, I want to take the opportunity to thank our UCLA Alumni Association for our sustaining donors. Because of your amazing support, we are able to make programs like this possible. So again, thank you to our wonderful sustaining donors. For some housekeeping, we will be recording this session and we'll send out a link for the recording when it's available after the event. And also don't worry, slides will also be made available to you in a follow-up email to all our attendees of today's webinar. And if you would like closed captioning, be sure to click on the Show Captions button below. And also, because we have a lot of content to go through, we will try our best to have time for a Q&A at the end of the session today. So please use the Q&A function as well to enter in your questions rather than the chat, because we will be using the chat throughout the program. But if you have specific questions, use the Q&A function there. And if we have some time at the end, we'll be sure to get to your questions. And also after the session, we encourage you to fill out our post-event survey. We welcome your feedback to help us create future programming for managers like yourself. And also we welcome just your thoughts on how today will go, and then also, what we can do to improve. So now let's get started. Today's session of this Supervisors Academy will dive into human resources concepts for new managers. This session will dig into the nuts and bolts from onboarding to separations with an employee. And while your individual companies will have their own unique policies, our speaker will explore these topics to help you familiarize yourself and explore some of the nuances and complexities that exist. For those of you who are note takers, again, we will send out the slides. So take notes as you will to stay engaged, but don't worry, we will send out the slides after so that you have them. So let's get to it. I'm excited to introduce our speaker today. Taneen is a 2008 graduate of UCLA and is an in-house employee relations leader and employment attorney with 12 years of experience across technology, media, and nonprofit companies. She coaches executives and managers through high-stakes employee relations matters and advises on equitable people practices, including culture-building initiatives. So welcome, Taneen. Take it away.
Hi, everyone. I'm very excited to be here for day 2. Before we get started, I would love to see everyone in the chat. Share with us where you're tuning in from. Are you in LA? Are you in the Bay Area? Are you in another state? Where is everyone tuning in from? Okay, we have some Los Angeles, more Los Angeles, go Bruins, Long Beach. Amazing. Okay, it looks like most of us are in California. That's great because, okay, we have some other states in here. Yorba Linda. Excellent. So this presentation is geared towards California law, California employers, rules that might apply to you as a manager or an employee in California. But I do come at it from a multi-state perspective because most employers these days do have multi-state operations. Gloria introduced me, so I will spare you another intro. But here is a little bit about me, UCLA class of 2008, and I've been in private practice now for 5 years with 12 years of in-house experience, mostly working very, very closely with HR. So the goal of this presentation is really coming at it from a legal and HR perspective, so you can get a better understanding of how HR is thinking about these issues, how they are issue spotting these issues, so that you can be really prepared to deal with these issues when they come up, or at least to spot these issues when they come up. And a lot of what we think about as HR people is the business strategy. So business strategy informs HR strategy. So typically what HR leaders will do is they'll think about what are the organizational goals? What are the key functions required to meet those goals? What's the talent that's required to run those key functions? What's the market for those key functions? What does that talent look like? How expensive is that talent? How do we retain that talent? What policies will make us competitive in retaining that talent? And what policies will make sense in the context of our values and our goals? So typically the way HR is thinking about everything is through that lens. All right, so here I have on my screen the 10 different topics that I'm planning on going through today. But I'd like to hear from you all when you look at this list. What is the thing you're most nervous about? What's the thing that is out of your comfort zone? That when it comes up at work, you get nervous, you think you have some blind spots? Just put in the number in the chat of the one area that makes you a little bit nervous, a little bit out of your comfort zone. All right, investigations, separations. We have a lot of 5s here. Investigations, some time off work, 7. Okay. 4, time off work, sure. 4 is very nerve-wracking for even HR professionals who've been HR executives for decades. Get really nervous about time off work, leaves of absence. Okay, so I will go ahead and focus the time on these topics because of course we only have an hour. So really we're going to just be dropping into these topics, kind of getting a big picture overview, but I will make sure that I spend some time on investigations and separations and the leaves as well, and confidentiality. Okay, so we're going to spend a little bit of time first on exemption and classification of employees. So one of the first things you might be dealing with as a manager when you're looking to fill a role or fill a gap is this person an employee or a contractor? Okay, and this is very important, not just for people's morale and their sense of autonomy and whether they're an employee or whether they're an independent contractor, but also it has very strong legal implications because when an employee is W-2, those payroll taxes go straight to the state. They fund Social Security, they fund unemployment programs. So misclassification of an employee as a contractor is something that the state is very interested in, right? Because they have a stake in that paycheck. Now, of course, a 1099 employee, they're their own vendor, they're in business for themselves. You pay them the full amount that they're owed based on the contract, and they're supposed to manage their own taxes. Now, a lot of small businesses will 1099 employees because they're growing, their payroll operations aren't really set up. Maybe they can't really afford to put someone on payroll. And these are sort of some red flags that you want to spot. But typically, if someone gets audited by the EDD over a classification issue, these are some of the things that they're going to look at on this screen here to determine whether or not someone was properly classified as an employee or a contractor. So they're going to look at how the work is assigned, whether this person has their own website, whether they do the same services for a lot of other companies, how they're paid, how they're let go, how they're managed. If someone seems to be operating like an employee, they're probably misclassified. And especially in California, this can be a trouble area because California is only getting more and more strict on these classifications. And you may have experienced this. You may have yourself attempted to work with a company as an individual 1099 contractor, and they said no. They said, sorry, but we just can't. We have to pay you on payroll. I want to briefly talk a little bit about exemption because as a manager, if you have employees who are hourly or salary, you will be thinking about this, right? So when we say someone is exempt, what we mean is, are they exempt from overtime, right? Are they exempt from overtime laws? There's federal overtime laws, there's state overtime laws, sometimes there's local overtime laws. And usually the state laws are going to be more stringent than the federal one. So in California, often we're looking at the California exemption laws versus the federal one. So if you're a California manager and you're sort of Googling exemption for, your software engineer in California, you're going to get information that's actually not applicable at all to that employee, because the state of California is very specific on how computer software engineers are going to be classified. So essentially, if you are exempt, it means that you fall into a category that does not entitle you to overtime pay. Non-exempt is entitled to overtime pay, meal breaks, and rest breaks. And again, this is very specific to the state that you are in. California is one of the most strict. So this is some of the job duties that will make someone exempt from overtime, right? So not entitled to overtime. So someone who's in an executive role, they manage 2 or more employees, they can hire and fire people. There's also a professional exemption, and this is often people in learned or artistic fields, like for example, an art director, right? They might be exempt from overtime if they spend at least half of their working time coming up with original concepts in their head that someone else in the same role might not come up with, right? Because they get to exercise a lot of discretion and independent judgment in that role. A computer software professional is also has a very special exemption in California law, where in order to fall under the exemption, you'll see here that their base salary has to be quite high. And this is something I see managers and HR run into a lot, where they're not actually paying their software engineers enough, especially the junior ones. They're not meeting this threshold. So if they're not meeting this threshold, they should actually be hourly employees who are getting overtime and who are clocking in and out. Now you'll notice that the base minimum salary for exempt employees in California is actually $66,560 right now, right? But the exemption for a computer software engineer is much higher. So these are just some of the peculiarities to keep in mind when you're thinking about, is this person correctly a salaried exempt employee? The other one is this administrative exemption, which I think most people relate to the most as maybe an office manager. An office manager is a great example of a role that's kind of in that gray area, because they do a lot of these non-manual general business operations work. But it's only going to fall under the administrative exemption if they're under general supervision only. So what does that mean? If you have an office manager that manages a huge budget, like a $10,000 per month budget, and they have a lot of discretion in how they use that budget, they're more likely to fall under the administrative exemption. But if they just kind of have a list of duties that they check off every day, they just kind of do what they're told, everything has to be approved, then they're way less likely to fall under that exemption. And they should be a salaried employee who's clocking in and out and is getting overtime and meal breaks. And then also there's the outside salesperson, which is really someone who's spending time away from the office, maybe like a door-to-door salesman. So if you manage non-exempt employees, a big part of your job is regulating their time. So there's a few aspects to this. One, if you have employees that are hourly, that are entitled to overtime, they really need to be signing in and signing out, and you need to have actual timestamps. So a lot of timekeeping software that companies use these days doesn't actually capture the actual time the employee started working and the actual time they went out for their lunch break, the time they clocked back in, and then the time that they clocked back out. It just kind of tells you, oh, this person worked a total of 8 hours in a day, but it doesn't give you the timestamps. And that's really problematic because then you have no way of proving that you actually gave that employee their required meal breaks. Because in California, that employee is entitled to a 30-minute uninterrupted meal break in the first 5 hours of working. So if they start working at 9 a.m., they have to clock out by 2 p.m. to take that 30-minute uninterrupted break. Now, it can be an unpaid meal break, but you have to provide it. And if you don't provide it, then that employee, unless they waived it specifically, unless you have it in writing that they're waiving their meal break and they're allowed to waive their meal break, they're actually entitled to a premium, a 1 hour paid premium for having missed that meal break. So this is where you see a lot of these class actions happening, is when employers are not keeping track of employees taking their meal breaks. And so what you have to do as a manager is you have to actually look at that person's timesheet and say, hey, in writing and and voice to voice, it's really important that you take these meal breaks. You're entitled to them. We have an obligation to make sure you're taking them. It's really important that you you take your break by X time and that it's a full 30 minutes and that it's uninterrupted. Because if they're not doing that, it's actually still on the company to enforce it. So this is a really important part of being a manager, is actually looking carefully at these timesheets. Now, rest breaks, the employee can manage on their own. They don't need to clock in and out for rest breaks, but the meal break is key. All right, I'm going to jump into hiring. So this will be a pretty quick slide. I talked a little bit earlier about how we want to think about hiring for roles, right? Especially these days when there's so many layoffs happening, so many roles being eliminated. Something you can do as a manager is think really critically about what are these essential functions that we need in order to meet our goals and not bloat your department too much. And you want to think about, what does the market for this talent look like? How do we benchmark compensation? And then another really important part is working with HR to design the interview process, because the reality is you can spend a lot of time designing the most beautiful interview process, but until you actually start working with someone, you just don't know if they're going to be the right fit for that role, if they're going to have the right skill set, if they're going to have the right job knowledge, if they're going to have the right approach and orientation in the role. You just don't know until you start working with someone. So you want to design the interview process as best as you can. And typically, what I like to do is to think about what is the actual work product that this person is going to be creating, and then ask for work samples, and then ask them questions about that work sample and really dig into how best can I understand how this person is going to perform on day one, especially with the economy, how it is. As a manager, you probably don't have that much time to train up people. You actually probably need to hire someone who can come into the role not only fully equipped to do the job, but actually someone who knows how to do the job better than you do. You probably need someone really skilled who can help take the company to the next level because it's so competitive. So it's really important in your interview process that you're thinking about how advanced is this person. And I think sometimes you have to be realistic about the level. One issue that I see a lot is within the first, 5 months, the manager will say, this person is not performing well in the role at all. They don't have the job knowledge, they don't have the skills. And I look at their salary and it makes sense right away why they're not the person for the job, because clearly they were junior, right? We have a junior person in the role who's going to have blind spots, who's not going to know what they don't know. And they're just going to get aggravated with all this feedback right away that they're not doing the job right. So that's why the interview process is so important. And you should never, ever skip the reference part. For me, references are even more key than the interview itself. And often what I'll do is during the interview process, I'll listen very carefully to what the candidate is saying. Maybe they'll talk about an experience that they had on a project where they're working with a really difficult stakeholder, right? And then later when it's time for references, I might say, hey, I know this is a little unusual, but you mentioned that really difficult stakeholder, and I know they might not be a typical reference for you, and I completely understand why, but I would love to talk to them as a reference, right? So I will handpick the people that I would like to speak to as a reference, and the way they respond to that can actually be way more informative than the interview itself. Also, in California, just so you all know, you have to have salary ranges now. And if a candidate asks you for a range for a job, you need to provide that. And also with background checks, you can't inquire as to someone's criminal history until after you've given them a conditional offer. All right, I know this is a lot of information. But we're going to move on to onboarding. So I'm assuming everyone here has been an employee. You've all been onboarded. Most of us are in California. So you're probably really familiar, right, with what is happening during an onboarding process, just in terms of the basic paperwork that you need to fill out. Now, as a manager, it's actually even more important that you read this handbook very, very carefully and understand it, because a part of your job is going to be understanding the policies and enforcing the policies. And another part of your job is going to be this 30, 60, 90 onboarding experience that more and more new hires are starting to expect. And some of you may have already experienced this, that as managers, you're actually becoming more and more responsible for onboarding the employee. Like typically the HR onboarding is like 30 minutes or 60 minutes with HR, very, very basic and broad overview. But really it's becoming more and more you and your team's responsibility to bring that employee into the fold and actually teach them about the culture, teach them about the process, and get them set up to succeed. So I think one of the best things you can do as a manager is to actually spend that time, make it one of your goals for the year to develop a great onboarding process for all of your new employees that your whole team has buy-in into. Okay, so time off work. So someone said they were really interested in time off work. So time off work can look like any of these things, right? So I'm actually curious to know if anyone sees one of these things and wants to put it in the chat of the one thing that seems the most overwhelming, you have the most blind spots on. We can talk a little bit about that more specifically. But some of these you might be more comfortable with, like taking sick, taking vacation. But as you can see, especially in California, there are a lot of different kinds of reasons why someone can take a leave. So I think it's important just to be aware of it. So for example, you'll notice here that reproductive loss leave is on here. This is a brand new leave entitlement for employees that gives them 5 unpaid days to take off if they've had a miscarriage or a stillbirth or even lost a child through an adoption process. So more and more, there's more reasons why an employee might be entitled to a leave. Okay, people are asking about personal leaves. Okay, so the thing about a personal leave, I'll get to the personal leave on the next slide because it'll make more sense. The other one to think, I want to point out is the school activity, school appearance leave. If someone says to you, hey, I have to go, take time off work because, my kid's in detention, this can actually be a protected kind of leave that's unpaid and has some restrictions. So something else to keep in mind. Now, I'm going to talk about the personal leave that people are asking about in the context of this chart. So what you're really thinking about when someone is taking time off work is 2 things. One, is the leave protected? What does that mean? That means that you have a right to reinstatement. When you come back from the leave, you have a right to the same job or an equivalent job, unless that role would have been eliminated regardless of whether you were on a leave. So that's why you see sometimes people are on a parental leave or, a maternity leave, and they still get laid off. And it's like, well, how is that possible? This is protected. Well, it's because if the employer can argue that that role would have been eliminated regardless of whether you're on a leave, it's actually allowed. But otherwise, you have a right to reinstatement if the leave is protected. So I'm gonna go back here. So certain types of leave, like FMLA leave, CFRA leave, these leaves are disability leave. These leaves are protected kinds of leaves. Is bereavement protected? An employer can choose to have a paid bereavement policy where you can take a few days off for bereavement, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a protected leave and you have a right to reinstatement. The same can be argued for vacation time versus sick leave is protected. Okay, a lot of these kinds of leave that you see here are protected. However, a personal leave of absence is not protected. That is not a protected type of leave. That's for your own personal reasons. So part of your job is to look and see, well, is it a personal leave? Or am I taking time off because I'm really stressed and overwhelmed? Maybe it's actually a medical leave. Maybe your physician can put you on a medical leave, right? Then that would give you more protection, and it might qualify you for disability insurance from the state, or if your company has a policy, a disability insurance policy, you can even get some money from that too. So that's why as an HR person, when someone asks for a personal leave, it actually makes it a lot easier for you because you don't have to worry about that person necessarily being entitled to pay, that person necessarily being entitled to protection and a right to reinstatement. So if you're advocating for yourself, and this is for yourself, I would encourage you to think, does my leave actually fall under a protected category? Because there's nothing stopping an employer when you're ready to return from a personal leave in saying, hey, actually, we filled the role while you were gone, sorry. So something to keep in mind about the personal leave. I hope that was helpful. But for example, if you were looking at a different type of leave, let's say FMLA, right? Let's say that you are looking at taking a family leave because you have to care for a close family member who's going through a very serious medical condition. The first thing you have to consider is the employer even covered? Because if the employer is a small employer, if they only have 5 or 6 employees, they're not going to be covered by FMLA. They might be covered by something else like the CFRA, but for the purpose of this example, they're not going to be covered by the FMLA, which means no, you don't have a leave entitlement. Now, the company might, out of for morale reasons or culture reasons or value reasons, they might offer you some time off under certain parameters in order to take time off to care for that person. They might even offer you some money or have their own policy. But from a statutory perspective, there's no leave entitlement. Now, if this was a large employer, had 50 plus employees, met the other requirements, then the next question is the employee eligible? Because sometimes these statutes or even policies require you to have certain tenure, certain amount of hours of service. They require you to live in a certain area. They might require you to work, at least 30 hours a week, for example. So if you get past that, then you start looking at, okay, well, is this a protected kind of leave? Yes or no? And then is it a paid leave? Yes or no? You can have a leave that's paid but not protected. And you can have a leave that's protected but unpaid, right? Now, in a lot of companies these days, even if a leave is not protected, they still want to do the right thing, and their intention is to protect that leave. But it's important for you as a manager, because if you know that leave is protected, you have to think differently about how you're going to fill that gap and cover that person's role during their time off, right? Because if it's not protected, you might just look to fill the role. But if it is protected, you might have to increase other people's workload. You might want to bring in a temp. You might want to outsource some of the work until they come back. So these are just some things to think about. Also, more things to think about here in these check boxes here is most companies are going to require your employee to make a formal request, right? So what I see happen sometimes is that the employee tells their manager that they think they need a leave, and then the employee just sort of disappears, right? So I think as a manager, you want to make sure that your employee understands you will need to, and connect with your HR to understand the process. But at this point, you're going to need to connect with this person, and you're going to have to make a formal request for the leave, and it's going to have to be approved. And it's during that approval process that the company will tell the employee your leave is protected, it's not protected. Also, if an employee goes on an unpaid leave, one of the effects of that is, well, what happens to their benefits, right? So depending on your state, depending on how long you've been an employee, depending on the type of leave, that person's benefits might expire, right? Or they might continue for 12 weeks. So these are the kinds of things that can really aggravate employees if no one is helping them understand early on that if they go out for, for example, on a personal leave, for a personal leave, there's no benefits entitlement on a personal leave. But on a disability leave, on an FMLA leave, you're entitled, your employer has to keep your benefits, continue your benefits for you for up to 12 weeks. They might ask you to pay your part that would have been deducted out of your salary, out of pocket, send them a check because you're unpaid. But these are just some of the issues to keep in mind. Often they'll require a medical certification for some of these leaves and also a medical release to come back to work. I know this is a lot. For what it's worth, this is a lot for everyone. That's why a lot of companies have specific benefits administrators who only administer these kinds of benefits because they can be very complex. Okay, so investigations. So I do a lot of investigations in my work. I typically have multiple investigations going on at any given time. So the main thing to know is that, and you'll know this after you read the handbook, as a manager, you are obligated to, if you hear about something that sounds like retaliatory, sounds like harassment, sounds like discrimination, sounds like bullying, if you hear about any of these things, you're mandated to bring it to the attention of HR because you represent the employer and it creates liability. It can create a strict liability for the employer. So you're required to tell the employer. So I'll talk about how this plays into confidentiality earlier on. Typically, as a manager, from the manager's perspective, if there's an investigation going on, you might know very little about it. You might just know that maybe someone on your team complained. You would know more if the complaint was about you, which I'll get to in a moment. But typically when you go into an investigation, you're asked to keep it confidential. You're asked to remember that retaliation is not allowed. You can't retaliate against anyone for bringing a complaint in good faith or for participating in a complaint. And you usually, don't really get a lot of satisfying information about how it's concluded unless you're the person who's complaining or you're the person being complained about. And even then, you usually just get some of the more relevant findings. You don't get the full investigation report. But it's some process that you can go through, right? And in California, employers have an affirmative duty to investigate, like promptly, objectively, and keep it as confidential as possible. So if you yourself are filing a complaint, one thing that you can do is just make sure you are documenting the process they're going through really well, so that if things go wrong later, you might have enough evidence to show that the employer did not meet their obligation of doing the investigation the way that they were supposed to. Now, if the investigation is about you, if there's a complaint about you, that can be very, very scary. And I will say this, which is more and more over the last 12 years, I have seen an enormous increase in how many employees are lodging formal complaints against their manager. And most of these complaints are not corroborated. So what I would say as some reassurance is that I am finding that this is becoming more and more commonplace. So not to take it personally, I think as organizations are becoming more diverse, which we talked about in yesterday's session, people are feeling more psychologically safe. People are feeling more comfortable raising complaints to HR. And, their job is to do the investigation and see if they can corroborate that more likely or not, what the complaint they're receiving is true. And if it's true, whether it's a violation of the policy, and then they go through disciplinary measures. So it can be very uncomfortable, but it's becoming more commonplace. Now I want to speak briefly about intellectual property. As a manager, you should know that everything the employee creates on employer time, on employer resources belongs to the company. This includes, tangible items like, their laptop. It also includes intangible items like emails, for example, anything that they work on that's related to the company. Like if they do work on their cell phone, they have a reduced expectation of privacy in their cell phone overall. If they're doing work, company work on their own device. However, there is an exception in California where anything that's developed entirely on the employee's own time without using the employer's equipment does belong to the employee. So this is just something to keep in mind. If you hear an employee say to you, hey, like, I actually did something like this in the past, like, through my own company or my own consulting, I developed this curriculum. Would you be interested in doing it here at this company? That should be a flag for you as a manager of like, okay, if I allow them to do this, it doesn't mean we own this, right? So you might say, you know what? No, I would like you to develop something for the company that we can continue to use. And now we're going to talk briefly about confidentiality. So I'll let you read what's on the screen, but I'm sure all of you at one point or another have had someone say to you, I want to talk to you about something, but only if you promise to keep it confidential. As a manager, you cannot do this. You cannot promise to keep anything confidential, and you can say to them, or if they tell you this on Slack, which is usually how it comes up, you can respond and say, hey, I really want to hear about what's going on, and I hope that you can trust me to use good judgment here, but I cannot promise you blanket confidentiality because it might be something I have to take action on. And if you say that, more likely than not, almost always, I have never yet had any instance where I have said that to someone and they have said, okay, never mind. They almost always will say, okay, fine, let's talk. Okay, but you will put yourself in a very bad position if you promise confidentiality, because you very much may have to report it to HR. And then you'll just lose credibility with that employee. So briefly on confidentiality, some things are confidential for legal reasons, some things are confidential for judgment reasons. Like it's just good judgment to keep it confidential. Now, things like investigations, those are supposed to be, legally speaking, as confidential as possible, right? So that's some terminology that you might hear, which means you have to really think about, in your role as a manager, it's probably not necessary for you to tell anybody about a complaint besides HR, right? So also something that's important to know, in California, audio recordings require two-party consent, and it's actually a misdemeanor to record people without their permission. So if you're recording meetings, just let people know. Just say, especially in Zoom, it's so easy now. They click and they accept to be recorded. So I would say that if you think you need to record things for any reason, even as CYA, it's not going to be good CYA if there's not some sort of consent. Okay, and it's just going to make it more challenging for you in the future to use that recording. Here are some examples of some other things that get tied to confidentiality, and you can just kind of read through these. And again, you will get all of these slides. Okay, now we're getting into reasonable accommodations. And we're doing pretty good on time. So the thing that I want every manager to understand about reasonable accommodations is that the only time you should be thinking about making a reasonable accommodation is when the employee is telling you, or you have reason to believe, that a medical condition is impacting their job, their ability to do their job or do their job safely. If someone just keeps, and these days I see this more and more, employees feel very comfortable telling their managers, I'm neurodivergent, I have anxiety, I have ADHD. They're very comfortable sharing I'm type 1 diabetic. They're very comfortable sharing their medical conditions with their manager, right? But if you ask them, hey, is this condition impacting your ability to do your job? They will almost always say, no, it's not, right? So a mistake I see managers make is that just because they hear about the medical condition, they think they need to go through a reasonable accommodation process, but that can actually be very aggravating for the employee. And they can actually start feeling like you're treating them differently because of their medical condition. So it's very important to ask, is this making it hard for you to do your job? Now, if the employee is performing very well, then it's probably not. If you see that the employee is having a performance issue, then you might say, hey, I'm concerned because I'm seeing that you are, you seem really upset, right, on calls. I'm really concerned, right? Is there something going on? I want to remind you that we have reasonable accommodations if you need them. We have leaves of absence if you need them. We have other benefits if you need them, right? So when there's actually a performance issue, then you can kind of open that door to hey, like, do you need a reasonable accommodation? But if there's no performance issue, there's really no reason to dig into the employee's health condition with them. And in fact, it can be quite inappropriate and quite triggering. So just because your employee tells you that they have a medical condition does not mean you should tell them to go fill out a reasonable accommodation form with HR. And actually, I recently had a situation with a client where an employee was extremely upset and aggravated and felt like their manager forced them to fill out a reasonable accommodation form when they did not feel like it impacted their ability to do their job at all. So I have a few other I've kind of built out this slide so you can use it as a reference. Typically, you're not going to be the one doing the reasonable accommodation inquiry, but what I will say is if you are offering any sort of accommodation, no matter how small, for example, if someone says to you, hey, I have MS, and so I can't always be on video because of my setup, right? You might want to send them an email and say, hey, this is what you asked, and I think that's fine. That's approved, right? And then you might want to loop in HR as well. So right from the beginning, you're kind of documenting all of the accommodations you're making, even if it seems informal or simple or not a big deal. Here's a list of potential accommodations that you can look at in your own time. I will say that reasonable accommodations can be very tricky for employers because there's a very, very high bar to prove that making an accommodation would be an undue hardship on the employer. It's a very high bar. And if you go through the process of trying to find a reasonable accommodation, and you can't find one, you're actually required as an employer to start the process all over again until you can find a reasonable accommodation, or if you can prove that no reasonable accommodation exists, which is a very high bar. So again, these are very tricky for employers, but the way to make it untricky is to actually have that conversation with the employee where you really engage them and talk to them and document everything that you're trying to do, so that at least they get that due process and that experience of really attempting to find something that will work for them. And this slide kind of illustrates how trying this process can be to make sure that the employee has really, gone through an interactive process with you to find a reasonable accommodation. The bar is very high for these. The employer has an affirmative duty to go through an interactive process with the employee, and there's punitive damages that an employer can face if they don't meet that obligation. So these are pretty serious. It's never going to be sufficient to send an employee a link to like a page on the internet that says something about reasonable accommodations. It always needs to be very interactive. Hey, let's get on a call. Okay, what are your limitations? What do you think might work for you? Here's what I think is going to work for you. Why don't we try this and check in 2 weeks and see how it worked? Okay, we're checking in. Like it has, and you have to get creative. You have to propose your own ideas. What if we tried this? What if we tried that? So something to keep in mind. Separations and offboarding. So, many of you probably have been separated from an organization or gone through an offboarding. So I don't think a lot of this is going to be necessarily shocking. I think one thing that you think about as a manager is, how much notice do I give people when I'm letting them go? How much transition time do I give them? What does that look like? Right? And your employer might have some standards around this. Like a lot of employers, they want to shut off people's access that very day, right? That they're let go. And, they've been burned by, disgruntled employees, and they don't want to take that risk again. So you might not have a choice. But at some companies, you may actually have a choice. So what I find is, if you're in a position, and I do these a lot, this is kind of a bit of my bread and butter and my practice. So if you find yourself in a situation where you are letting someone go, but you do want to give them that notice and that transition time, and you think that's in line with the company values, my recommendation is that you prescribe what the transition period is going to look like very specifically. Like you create a very narrow path, and the conversation goes something like, your role is being eliminated. However, we've come up with a transition plan that we would like to share with you. Here is the transition plan. Today, you will get off this call and you will take the rest of the day to decompress. Tomorrow, and then we're going to ask you to do this, and you can take the rest of the time to decompress and look for other work. You're going to talk to us before you communicate about these changes externally or internally. And if you do all this transition stuff that we've asked, on your last day, we will offer you a severance agreement in this amount, so long as we stay on good terms, which we expect to. So as long as you make it very, very clear, narrow walkway, that tends to go the best. And it can give you that smooth exit that you're looking for without just like cutting somebody off. And I also find that exit interviews are really important, because you're giving an employee that space to vent. You might not be the best person to the exit interview, HR might be, but I find that some employees are offended if they are not asked to do an exit interview before they go, but I always offer it as an option. It's not mandatory, it's an option. And then it can be a good opportunity to just listen and hear and acknowledge that employee. And we talked a lot about listening yesterday. Okay, so we have just enough time here for this case study. So you will see a lot of text on these next slides. And I did that on purpose, because we say in HR, like document, 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 but we don't necessarily like tell you, and this is what the document should look like, right? So the point of this is that you can take something with you that has actual language of what documentation is that you can use. I'm going to highlight to you what parts of the documentation I think are key or tricky or worth you thinking about. So this case study is about an employee, Adar, okay, who is usually responsible for managing a PR vendor. Okay, but Adar has been overwhelmed, has been crying on calls, is not prioritizing work, is falling behind. So you decide that Adar is no longer going to manage his PR vendor, and Jem, who's on a different team, is going to manage the PR vendor instead. And unfortunately, instead of taking work off of Adar's plate, giving her more space to thrive, it has only caused her to become even more paranoid about her job security. And she's feeling very badly about this and is starting to blame Jem and is starting to attribute this to Jem. And you're hearing other people saying bad things about Jem. And you're just seeing that Adar is becoming more and more emotional and acting out on calls. Now, this is very tricky for a couple reasons. One, when you see someone is getting very, very emotional, a part of you should automatically start thinking, are they okay? Like, I'm concerned. Is this a potential, does this person maybe need a medical leave or a reasonable accommodation, right? Because we're seeing, it's apparent to people that they are not themselves. Okay, so that's the first thing that's making this tricky. The second thing that's making this tricky is that what the performance issue seems to be is more of their communication and how they're showing up, and their attitude, which can be when you coach people on those things, it can be experienced as a microaggression, right? So you want to be really careful about how you give people feedback around some of these softer skills. Okay, so what steps do you take? So the first thing you always want to do in a situation like this is, what is your goal? Okay, and as that person's manager, you should already have an idea of whether this person is going to work out long-term or not, right? So if your goal is to exit this person from the organization versus to support them in kind of getting through what seems like a hard time because they're a very valued employee, that immediate orientation over what your goal is going to define what steps you take, right? Because if your goal is to exit the person, it's going to be a different strategy than if your goal is to get them past this. So that should be the first sort of gut check moment. Is this person going to be on your team for the 5 more years? Or do you actually need to replace this person because they're not effective in the role? Now, another goal should be to, be fair. We want to give people a reasonable opportunity to improve. We want to put people on notice, give them a chance. And also, the last one I put here is peace, but really what that's saying is we don't want to burn our bridges with people, right? Most people come and work here because they want to network, they want to grow, they want to bring value. It's not working out. We don't necessarily need to have a fear-based approach to it, like, oh my God, like this person's going to sue us. If we treat people that way, if we treat people like we're scared of them, they're more likely to behave in a way that's scary, versus if we trust someone, we lead with trust, tends to go better, especially if you've had a trusting relationship with someone over the course of months and years, and then suddenly you treat them like they're untrustworthy. That is going to be very unsettling for them, and then you're not putting them in a position to be able to transition into a new kind of relationship. So here are other things for you to consider. I talked a little bit about the reasonable accommodations, the tone policing. Yesterday, we talked a lot about listening and getting their perspective. You might be at a company that requires a performance improvement plan. I personally don't do performance improvement plans. I do not think that they are effective, but you might be at a company that requires them as part of the process. And another thing is managing perceptions, especially in a situation where someone is very emotional. They might get a reputation for being that way, and then you might hear other people say it. And as a manager, it's your job to say, wait, hold on a second. I talked to this person about this and I see that they're improving. When was the last time that you experienced this with them? Because you want to help manage their reputation into a better place and kind of stop the bad reputation that they have and reorient it as their manager. That's how you can be a great advocate for them and help them improve and get past that narrative. So this is usually the script. I'll get the time. Few minutes. I'll let you look at this script. And we did talk about this yesterday as well. So you will see that in the slides if you weren't here yesterday, about how you start talking to them one-on-one about the issues. And you do want to have a one-on-one conversation about it. And you want to set the tone for it. You might even have a separate meeting. Hey, I know we have our regular check-in on Monday, but I want to have a serious conversation with you today, you know, or tomorrow. Let's set up some time to talk about it. So you go into it, you know, it's going to be uncomfortable, but that's actually important so that they understand the importance of it. So this is what your documentation might look like. And the way I've set up this documentation, it would be one email, but I'm kind of breaking it out so you can see the different parts. So in this particular example with Adar, the issue is she was not prioritizing things correctly and she was falling behind, right? That's the reason why the work got taken off her plate. So here you're talking a little bit about what exactly is going wrong. What is this specific performance issue and the examples. And then here's another example. So here you see how I might talk to them about something really tricky, like their tone or their communication or their language, so that it's not perceived as a microaggression. And you're telling them, you know, a very plain observation, you appeared to scoff when another team member was speaking. You'll see that I didn't put Jem's name, right? We don't want to bring other people into it. I acknowledge this has been frustrating, but it's not effective. This is what we do expect for you to be collaborative. And the way you behaved is going to make someone feel defensive. In this particular case, the person responded. Clearly, it was triggering for them because they said, I'm too much of a people pleaser, and I don't really like this feedback. And that's typical. You might get something like that. It's okay. I don't want you to feel like you have to respond to every single thing someone says. The important thing is that you got your message across. And then here is how I deal with the potential reasonable accommodation issue. You'll see here that I say, you seem to be having a difficult time. You mentioned you felt overwhelmed. I'm concerned. Is there anything preventing you from meeting these expectations? And then you tell them about what reasonable accommodations might be available. And this is something that HR will probably want to draft or be involved in. And then this was the response. No, thanks. Yes, I'm overwhelmed because the company is disorganized. You know, that's not great feedback, but actually, I think this is a great response because what this employee is saying is, no, I don't need a reasonable accommodation. I just think you all are disorganized. Fine, no problem. Thank you for letting us know. Again, we don't need to argue over things that are not important. Our goal was to get the message across that we need them to prioritize better and communicate effectively, and we did that. And of course, this is probably the most important line of all, which is a notice that if it continues, their job will be in jeopardy. If you let someone go without having anything in writing that says their job is in jeopardy, HR is probably going to delay them being let go. And of course, HR might not be comfortable with you putting this statement in an email without consulting with them first. But if you don't get ahead of the performance issues, you might find yourself in a situation where you already know the person's not going to work out. But you have to like continue documenting the issues because you never gave them this clear notice that their job will be in jeopardy. Here's some takeaways. Again, are you giving them a fair opportunity to improve? Is it equitable? Is this how you would treat anyone on your team? Is this the kind of, why are you giving this person 3 chances and that person no chances? And then of course, making that decision of whether or not, you think that person is going to work long-term or not, and the formal notice. That's it. We didn't have time for questions. But I want to respect everyone's time. I know this is a quick hour. So if you enjoyed this, if you'd like to talk more about this, if you'd like to talk in a more informal, smaller setting about more particular issues, please fill out the survey. Let us know how this could have been better, what else would be helpful for you. And thank you all for your time. And I think Gloria just put the post survey link in there.
And great. Thank you so much, Tanine. Again, so full of information. I think both days we could have gone hours and hours, but thank you everyone for attending today. We will be sending slides for both sessions and links to the recordings for both. So don't worry. As you are processing this, Tanine and I are already thinking about ideas for future programming. So we welcome your thoughts. Also, join us to share what you're thinking as well on the survey. And we hope to see you at future events. Again, thank you, Tanine, for your expertise and bringing this information to our alumni. We hope, again, we want to empower all of our alumni to be great supervisors and to enjoy this experience. But we also know they can be tricky and nuanced. And so thank you, Tanine, for walking us through so many different scenarios. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your week and go Bruins.
Thank you.
Goodbye.